Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was trained by Batman to protect Gotham. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The rain in Gotham didn't fall so much as it seeped. It was a greasy, persistent drizzle that clung to the air, tasting of rust and exhaust fumes. It dripped from the stone jaws of gargoyles that had long forgotten what they were meant to be guarding, and it collected in fractured pavement, reflecting the bruised purple and orange glow of the city's eternal twilight. For Izuku Midoriya, it was the sound of home. He hunched his thin shoulders, pulling the worn hood of his jacket tighter around his head. The thin fabric was already soaked through, plastering his unruly mop of dark green hair to his scalp. Beneath the jacket, his school uniform was damp and cold against his skin. Another day, another failure. The thought was as familiar and constant as the rain itself. Izuku clutched the strap of his yellow backpack to his chest like a shield. It was the only vibrant color in the muted palette of his Coventry district neighborhood, a splash of defiant yellow against a world of damp brick and shadowed asphalt. Inside, nestled amongst his schoolbooks, was his most precious possession, Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13. It was a tattered, waterlogged tome, its pages warped and soft from countless exposures to Gotham's climate. But to Izuku, it was a sacred text. Its pages were crammed with his spidery, frantic handwriting, detailing the tactics, equipment, and fighting styles of every known hero and vigilante. He had pages on the godlike figures, Superman's invulnerability tested against the theoretical kryptonite dust aerosol, the Flash's potential vulnerabilities at near light speed, but his most detailed work, his masterpiece, was on Gotham's own creatures of the night. Dozens of pages were dedicated to Batman. Sketches depicted the subtle variations in his suit over the years. Notes hypothesized about the composition of his grappling line, the decibel level of his stealth takedowns, the psychological principles behind the symbol on his chest. He had cross-referenced police reports with blurry news footage, timing the vigilantes' response times, mapping his patrol routes, and theorizing on his unseen support network. He even had a small, respectful section on the Robins. The first, now operating in Bloodhaven as Nightwing. The second, a ghost, a tragedy whispered about in the darkest corners of the crime-fighting community. Izuku had marked that page with a small, sad star. To most, this obsession was a symptom of his foolishness. In a city that chewed up dreamers and spat them out as cynics or corpses, Izuku's unwavering belief in heroes was a mark of naivety. In a world where metahumans could level city blocks, his own powerlessness was a cruel joke. He had been born plain, normal, a baseline human in an age of wonders and terrors. Still scribbling in that creepy stalker journal, Deku? The voice, sharp and abrasive, cut through the din of the rain. Izuku froze, his heart sinking into the pit of his stomach. He didn't need to turn around. He knew that voice better than his own. Katsuki Bakugo stood under the meager shelter of a storefront awning, flanked by two of his usual cronies. He wasn't big in the way a movie thug was big, but he was solid, coiled with a wiry strength and an explosive confidence that made him seem to take up more space than he did. His ash-blonde hair was immune to the rain's oppressive weight, and his crimson eyes held a familiar, casual cruelty. "It's not a stalker journal, Kaken," Izuku mumbled, his gaze fixed on a crack in the sidewalk. It's analysis." "Analysis?" Bakugo scoffed, stepping out into the drizzle. He snatched the notebook from Izuku's hand before the smaller boy could even react. "Let's see what the great analyst is working on today." He flipped through the pages with a dismissive roughness, his friends snickering as they looked over his shoulder. "Look at this. Little stick figures of Batman. You really think this loser could ever be a hero? He's not even smart enough to carry an umbrella." Izuku's hands clenched into tight, useless fists. "Give it back." The words were a whisper, barely audible over the hiss of tires on the wet street. Bakugo's smile was a predator's. "What was that, Deku? I couldn't hear you over the sound of how pathetic you are." He held the notebook aloft. "You know, in a city like this, you've got two choices. You can be strong, or you can be a victim. And you, with your stupid notes, and your stupid dreams." He let the notebook drop. It landed with a wet slap in a deep, murky puddle, The yellow cover instantly stained brown. The ink on the open page, a detailed breakdown of a new grapple launcher prototype, began to bleed immediately. Something inside Izuku snapped. It wasn't anger, not the explosive kind Bakugo possessed. It was a cold, quiet despair that momentarily eclipsed his fear. That notebook was his life's work. It was the only part of him that felt strong, the only place where his dreams felt real. Why? Izuku asked, his voice trembling as he looked up, meeting Bakugo's eyes for the first time. Why do you have to be so mean? For a second, Bakugo looked almost surprised. Then his expression hardened into a scowl. Because Gotham doesn't have time for worthless, daydreaming geekus. People like you get people killed. You want to be a hero so bad? He shoved Izuku hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back. Take a swan dive off a roof and pray you're born with powers in your next life. The words hit Izuku harder than the shove. He stood there, shivering in the rain, as Bakugo and his friends laughed and walked away, their insults trailing behind them like exhaust fumes. He was left alone with the dripping buildings, the distant wail of a siren, and his drowned dream lying in the gutter. He knelt, his knees soaking through his trousers, and gently lifted the notebook from the puddle. The pages were a mess, the ink running in rivulets of black and blue, a watercolor painting of his failure. He clutched it to his chest, the cold water seeping into his uniform, and for the first time that day, let the tears come. They were hot against his cold cheeks, indistinguishable from the rain. The walk home was a blur of misery. Izuku took the long way, through the labyrinthine alleys that crisscrossed Coventry, not wanting to face his mother with his tear-streaked face and ruined notebook. These were the veins of Gotham, narrow and dark, smelling of damp garbage and decay. The towering buildings on either side blocked out what little light remained in the sky, creating a premature night. It was in one of these alleys, a shortcut he'd taken 100 times, that he saw them. 3 men, built like dockworkers with the hungry eyes of wolves, had a family cornered against the graffiti-scarred brick wall. A father, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. A mother, clutching a small girl to her side. The girl, no older than 6, was sobbing quietly, her face buried in her mother's coat. She was holding a worn, one-eyed teddy bear. Just give us the wallet, pal. The leader of the thugs sneered. He had a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck. And the lady's purse. Nice and easy, we don't have much. The father pleaded, his voice shaking. Please, just let us go. Izuku flattened himself against the cold, wet brick of the opposite wall, hidden in the deep shadows of a dumpster. His breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to pretend he hadn't seen anything. He was Deku. Useless. What could he possibly do? He wasn't strong. He wasn't fast. He had no powers. He was a skinny, soaking wet kid with a ruined notebook. A hero would do something. The thought was an intruder, an unwelcome spark in the cold terror that had seized him. He looked at the little girl, her small body shaking with fear, and saw himself. Small, helpless, and desperately in need of a hero. But there are no heroes here. The thugs were getting impatient. The leader grabbed the father's shoulder, shoving him against the wall. I'm not asking again! Izuku's mind raced, his analytical brain kicking into overdrive despite the paralyzing fear. 3 hostels. Close quarters. One appears to be the leader, dominant posture. The other 2 are flanking. They're focused on the family. Their backs are partially turned to my position. No visible firearms, but likely carrying knives. Distraction is the only option. A loud noise. Create a window of opportunity for the family to escape. His analysis was a cold, clinical process, a familiar comfort. But the conclusion was terrifying. The distraction had to be him. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Don't do it. You'll die. Kaken was right. He saw the thug raise a hand to strike the father. The world seemed to slow down. The drip of the rain, the frantic thumping of his own heart, the little girl's muffled sobs. He saw the trajectory of the thug's arm, the fear on the father's face, the desperate hope in the mother's eyes as she glanced around for any sign of help. His body moved before his brain could issue a final, sensible veto. With a choked, desperate cry, Izuku swung his heavy, waterlogged backpack off his shoulder. He put every ounce of his wiry frame into the throw. It wasn't a powerful or accurate toss, but it was enough. The bright yellow bag sailed through the air in a clumsy arc, smacking the leader squarely in the back of the head. Thwack! The sound was shockingly loud in the confines of the alley. The leader grunted, stumbling forward in surprise, his hand dropping from the father. All three thugs spun around, their eyes searching the darkness. "Run!" Izuku screamed, his voice cracking with fear and adrenaline. "Get out of here!" For a heart-stopping second, the family just stared. Then the father, seeing his chance, grabbed his wife and daughter's hands and sprinted down the alley, away from the confrontation. The thugs watched them go, then turned their collective, furious attention to the source of the interruption. Izuku stood frozen at the mouth of the alley, skinny and trembling, illuminated by the faint, sickly glow of a distant street lamp. The leader rubbed the back of his head, his face twisting into a mask of predatory rage. "Well, well? What do we have here?" "A little hero." He cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing off the wet brick. The other two fanned out, their expressions promising a world of pain. They advanced on Izuku slowly, savoring the moment. Izuku's analytical mind had shut down completely, replaced by a pure, primal terror. His legs felt like they were filled with cement. He had saved them. But he had just doomed himself. He squeezed his eyes shut, a pathetic whimper escaping his lips. He was going to die in a filthy alley, all for a stupid, reckless impulse. A sudden change in the atmosphere made him open his eyes. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a feeling. The air grew heavy, colder. The constant patter of the rain on the pavement seemed to quiet, as if in deference. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the rooftops above, descending with an unnatural silence. It was not a fall, but a controlled, predatory drop. It landed between Izuku and the thugs. There was no thunderous crash, only the soft sound of a heavy cape settling. The figure rose to its full, terrifying height, a monument of black and gray. It was larger than any man Izuku had ever seen, a walking embodiment of the city's Gothic architecture. Two pointed ears cut a demonic silhouette against the dim light, and from the cowl, two lenses glowed with a faint, chilling white. It was Batman. For a moment, no one moved. The thugs were frozen, their blustering rage instantly evaporating, replaced by a raw, superstitious fear. This wasn't a man. It was the monster from their nightmares, made real. The first thug, regaining a sliver of courage, pulled a knife and lunged with a wild yell. The fight, if it could be called that, was over in seconds. Batman moved with a brutal, economical grace. A blur of black. There was the sharp crack of the thug's wrist breaking, his scream cut short as an armored elbow connected with his jaw. The second man charged from the side, only to have his leg swept out from under him. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, and a swift, precise strike to his temple rendered him unconscious. The leader, the man with the spiderweb tattoo, watched his men fall and made a sound that was half scream, half sob. He turned to run. He didn't get 2 steps. A black grappling line shot out, wrapping around his ankle. He was yanked off his feet, dragged back across the wet pavement, and hoisted upside down, dangling helplessly a foot off the ground. Batman stood over him, a silent judge. "You and your friends are going to Blackgate," he said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, synthesized growl that seemed to vibrate in Izuku's very bones. "Tell the others. This is my city." He left the man dangling and turned. Those white, unblinking lenses fixed on Izuku. Izuku felt a new wave of fear, entirely different from the one he felt for the thugs. This was awe and terror mixed together. He was standing in front of a living legend, the subject of 13 volumes of his life's work. And he looked angry. Batman closed the distance in 2 long, silent strides, looming over him. "What did you think you were doing?" the growl demanded. Izuku stammered, unable to form a coherent thought. The little girl. I had to. You had to get yourself killed?" Batman cut in, his voice dangerously low. "You're a child. You are untrained and unequipped. Your interference was reckless. You're lucky to be alive." The words were a verbal version of Bakugo's shove. They stung, confirming every negative thought Izuku had about himself. He was weak. Pathetic. A Deku. He looked down at his feet, shame and disappointment washing over him. He had met his hero, and all he'd done was prove what a failure he was. As he looked down, he saw his ruined notebook lying near Batman's boot, where it had fallen from his backpack. It had flopped open to a page smeared with rainwater and grime. The ink was a blurry mess, but the drawing was still visible. It was a complex schematic, annotated with dozens of tiny notes. Batman followed his gaze. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he bent down and picked up the book. The action was so unexpected it shocked Izuku into silence. He held it in one gauntlet hand, his head tilted slightly as he examined the page. Izuku's heart sank even further. Now his hero would see just how pathetic his obsession truly was. But Batman didn't scoff. He didn't laugh. He just stood there, silently, turning a page. And then another. His posture, which had been aggressive and intimidating, shifted subtly. It became one of intense focus. He stopped on a specific page, one Izuku knew well. It was his analysis of Mr. Freeze. The page was a cascade of notes and diagrams. It wasn't about fighting Victor Fries. It was about his suit. Izuku had spent weeks researching cryotechnology, thermodynamics, and material sciences. The main text of his analysis was now a blurry smear, but a key diagram in the margin, drawn with a waterproof pen, was still clear. It pointed to a small, secondary coolant line near the suit's left temporal lobe, with a note scrawled beside it. Sub-zero coolant requires constant pressure. A sudden, sharp increase in localized atmospheric pressure, e.g., a controlled sonic pulse at 20 to 25 kHz, could theoretically cause a microfracture at this joint. Not a rupture, but a leak. A pinhole leak would force an emergency system shutdown to prevent core meltdown. Non-lethal takedown opportunity. It was a detail he'd gleaned from a stolen schematic he'd found on a deep web forum. Cross-referencing it with the known tensile strength of the alloys Freeze was rumored to use. It was a one-in-a-million theory, born from hundreds of hours of lonely, obsessive research. Batman stood there for what felt like an eternity, his glowing lenses fixed on that diagram. The rain continued to fall, dripping from the points of his cowl. The dangling thug whimpered softly. Izuku held his breath. Finally, Batman looked up from the notebook, his gaze once again falling on the boy. The anger was gone from his posture, replaced by something Izuku couldn't decipher. It was a cold, calculating stillness. He had looked at criminals with less intensity. "Who are you?" The voice rumbled, no longer a reprimand, but a genuine question. "I Izuku. Izuku Midoriya," he stammered. Batman closed the notebook and held it out. Izuku took it with trembling hands, clutching the soggy book to his chest as if it were a life raft. "You were reckless, Izuku Midoriya," Batman said, his voice still a low growl, but the sharp edge was gone. "Courage without skill is a liability in this city." He paused, and the weight of that pause filled the entire alley. "But analysis like this is a skill." He reached into a pouch on his utility belt. He wasn't pulling out a batarang or a weapon. He produced a small, flat object. It was a simple piece of dark gray metal, no bigger than a coin, with his bat symbol subtly etched into its surface. He pressed it into Izuku's free hand. The metal was cold and impossibly smooth. "Gotham doesn't need another martyr," Batman said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It needs people who can think. People who can see the patterns others miss." He turned, his black cape swirling around him like smoke. "Wait!" Izuku called out, his voice stronger than he expected. "What is this?" Batman paused at the mouth of the alley, a silhouette against the city's glow. "It's a choice," he said without turning around. "If you want to do more than write in a book about changing the world, be at the top of the Gothcorp Tower at midnight tomorrow. Come alone." And then he was gone. A whirring sound, a flash of a grappling line catching on some unseen perch, and the shadow that was Batman melted back into the shadows of the city, leaving nothing behind but the sound of the rain and a dangling, terrified criminal. Izuku stood alone in the alley, his knuckles white as he clutched the ruined notebook in one hand and the cold, bat-shaped coin in the other. He was bruised, soaking wet, and trembling from the mix of fear and adrenaline. Bakugo's cruel words echoed in his ears. take a swan dive, but for the first time, another voice echoed alongside it. A deep, gravelly voice that had seen his work, his analysis, his soul poured onto paper, and had not called it pathetic. He had called it a skill. He looked from the coin in his hand to the dark, oppressive sky above. A choice. For his entire life, he had felt like he had no choices. He was Deku, the useless boy who could only dream. But now, a door had been opened. A dark, terrifying, and impossible door. A small, tremulous smile touched Izuku Midoriya's lips. The rain didn't feel so cold anymore. The night following his encounter with Batman was a sleepless, feverish eternity. Izuku lay in his small bed, the lumpy mattress a poor cradle for his racing thoughts. The rain had finally stopped, but the silence it left behind was somehow louder, filled with the frantic thumping of his own heart. In one hand, he clutched the cold, smooth metal coin, its bad insignia a tangible link to the impossible reality he had touched. In his other hand, he held his ruined notebook, a testament to the life he had lived until yesterday. He replayed the scene in the alley 1,000 times. The terror. The recklessness. The growl of Batman's voice. And that final, baffling moment of validation. Analysis like this is a skill. No one, not his teachers, not his classmates, not even his loving mother, had ever looked at his obsessive scribbling and called it a skill. They saw it as a hobby, a fixation, a sad substitute for the powers he so desperately wanted. But Batman had seen its worth. The coin was a choice. A terrifying, monumental choice. To stay here, in the life he knew, safe, predictable, and suffocatingly small, or to step through a door into a world of violence and shadow, a world he had only ever observed from a distance. There was no real choice at all. At 11:45 p.m. the next night, Izuku stood on the precipice of his future. The roof of the Gothcorp Tower was a windswept, lonely place. The city sprawled below him, a breathtaking tapestry of glittering lights and black voids. The distant, ever-present scream of sirens was a whisper from this height, the city's pain muted by altitude. He wore his sturdiest pair of sneakers and a dark green hoodie, feeling woefully inadequate and exposed under the vast, starless sky. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Was it a joke? A cruel test he had already failed simply by misinterpreting it? Had he been a fool to even come? He was about to turn away, to accept the crushing disappointment, when a soft, electronic chime emanated from his pocket. He fumbled for the coin. The bat symbol was glowing with a faint white light. A synthesized voice, a perfect replica of Batman's, spoke directly into the quiet air. Walk to the northeast corner of the roof. Do not look down. His heart hammered against his ribs. He obeyed, his legs feeling like lead as he crossed the gravel-strewn rooftop. As he reached the designated corner, he heard the low, almost imperceptible hum of an expensive engine from the street far below. A sleek, black sedan, its windows tinted to an impossible darkness, pulled up to the curb directly beneath him. A line will be deployed, the voice from the coin instructed. Secure it to the railing and descend. Izuku stared in disbelief. Descend? From a 50-story building? He peeked over the edge, and a wave of vertigo washed over him. He was supposed to rappel down the side of a skyscraper. This was insane. This was the first step. A quiet hiss cut through the wind, and a thin, impossibly strong-looking grappling line shot up from below, the claw at its end clamping securely onto the metal safety railing with a solid thunk. The line went taut, an invitation into the abyss. This was the real test. Not his analysis, but his nerve. Could he take that first, terrifying leap of faith? Izuku took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He thought of the family in the alley. He thought of a lifetime of being told he was useless. He closed his eyes, gripped the line with both hands, and swung his legs over the edge. The descent was a controlled fall, a terrifying ballet of gravity and fear. The automatic winch in the grapple lowered him at a swift but steady pace. The wind whipped at his clothes and roared in his ears. The city lights smeared into streaks of neon. He held on with a desperate, white-knuckled grip, his mind a blank slate of pure survival instinct. When his feet finally touched the solid asphalt of the alley beside the car, his knees buckled, and he would have collapsed if the back door of the sedan hadn't swung open. An old man in a perfectly tailored black suit stood there, one hand holding the door, an expression of calm patience on his finely wrinkled face. He had kind eyes, a neatly trimmed silver mustache, and an air of quiet dignity that seemed utterly alien to the grit of Gotham. "Mr. Midoriya, I presume," the man said, his voice a smooth, cultured British accent. "I am Alfred Pennyworth. Please do get in. Master Bruce is expecting you." Stunned into silence, Izuku numbly complied, sliding into the plush leather interior of the car. The door closed with a soft, satisfying click, sealing them in a cocoon of silence and luxury. The car smelled of polished wood and old money. Alfred got into the driver's seat, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb with a silent, electric grace. Where are we going?" Izuku finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "Home," Alfred replied simply, his eyes meeting Izuku's in the rearview mirror. There was a hint of a smile in them. "Try to get your bearings if you can. It will be a useful skill to develop." Izuku took the advice to heart, pressing his face against the cool glass of the window. He tried to track their path, but it was a fool's errand. The car moved through Gotham's arteries with an intricate, deliberate confusion, taking unexpected turns, circling blocks, and slipping through underpasses he never knew existed. They moved from the urban decay of Coventry to the glittering steel canyons of the financial district, and then further, into the exclusive, gated communities of the Palisades, where ancient trees stood sentinel over sprawling, dark estates. Finally, they turned onto a long, private road, flanked by a wrought iron fence whose spear-like tips seemed to pierce the clouds. At the end of the drive, silhouetted against the bruised pre-dawn sky, was a mansion. It wasn't just a house. It was a Gothic cathedral of wealth and history, with towering spires, stone gargoyles, and acres of shadowed grounds. It was Wayne Manor. Izuku felt a fresh wave of disbelief. He had read about the reclusive billionaire Bruce Wayne, the orphaned prince of Gotham. But to connect that tabloid figure with the creature of the night, it was a leap his mind was struggling to make. Alfred led him through the grand, echoing foyer, their footsteps the only sound in the cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight piercing the tall, stained glass windows. They stopped before a tall, ornate grandfather clock. Alfred reached out and gently moved the clock's hands to a specific time, 10:48. With a low groan of ancient mechanisms, the entire clock swung inward, revealing not a wall, but a dark, descending staircase. A cool, subterranean breeze, smelling of damp earth and ozone, washed over them. "This way, Master Izuku," Alfred said, his tone unchanged, as if revealing a secret passage to a subterranean lair was as routine as serving tea. The descent was long and cold. The polished wood of the staircase gave way to rough-hewn stone, and then to reinforced steel. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint, distant sounds of the city were replaced by the drip of water and the low hum of immense power. They emerged onto a platform overlooking a cavern so vast it seemed to swallow the light. Izuku's breath hitched. His analytical mind, which had been stunned into silence, roared back to life, trying to process the impossible sensory data. It was the Batcave. It was larger, deeper, and more real than he could have ever imagined. The ceiling was lost in shadow, festooned with sleeping bats that occasionally stirred, their collective whispers a living texture in the air. A massive computer system, its multiple screens glowing with data streams and city maps, formed the nerve center of the operation. Platforms and walkways of steel connected different sections of the cave. In one area sat the Batmobile, not the sleek, Hollywood version, but a brittlest piece of engineering that looked more like a tank than a car. In another, a sleek, black jet was nestled in its own alcove. And everywhere there were memories. A giant penny leaned against one wall. A terrifyingly lifelike animatronic Tyrannosaurus Rex stood silent and menacing in the shadows. And in a series of illuminated glass cases, a collection of costumes. Different variations of the Batsuit, a gray and blue Nightwing uniform, and a smaller case, set apart from the others. It held a Robin costume, bright red and yellow, but it was damaged, scorched, and torn. It felt less like a display and more like a memorial. A tombstone. "It is a lot to take in," Alfred said gently, noticing Izuku's stunned silence. "It's..." Izuku started, then stopped, unable to find the right word. It's real. Painfully so, a new voice said. Izuku spun around. Standing by the main computer, out of the bat suit, was the man himself. He wore simple black tactical pants and a tight gray t-shirt that did little to hide a physique sculpted by years of relentless, brutal effort. Scars, pale and silvery, crisscrossed his arms and torso like a roadmap of pain. His face was stern, his jaw set, and his eyes, they were the same eyes from the call. They were old, tired, and held a piercing intelligence that seemed to dissect Izuku on the spot. This was Bruce Wayne. Welcome to my home, Izuku Midoriya, Bruce said, his voice the same low rumble, but without the electronic distortion. It was more human, and somehow more intimidating. He gestured to the cave around them. This is not a playground. It is a war room. And the war we fight is one of attrition. It is endless, and it is unforgiving. He walked towards Izuku, his presence dominating the space. You showed me a flicker of potential in that notebook. A mind that sees the world in angles and probabilities. But a sharp mind is useless if the body and the will are weak. The life I lead is one of pain. Of sacrifice. You will be broken, physically and mentally. You will lose everything that makes you a normal boy. Your friends, your future, any chance at a happy life. That is the price. I'm going to give you one last chance to walk away. Alfred will drive you home, and we will never speak of this again. He stood before Izuku, an impassive mountain of a man, waiting for an answer. Izuku looked from Bruce's hard face to the memorial case holding the tattered Robin suit. He understood now. This wasn't an invitation to be a hero. It was an offer to become a soldier. A ghost. He thought of the bullies, of being called useless. He thought of the terror in the little girl's eyes, and the surge of purpose he felt when he threw his backpack. He had been nothing his whole life. This was a chance to be something. Even if that something was a weapon forged in darkness. He met Bruce Wayne's gaze, and for the first time, did not look away. I'm not leaving, he said, his voice shaking only slightly. A flicker of something, respect? Disappointment, passed through Bruce's eyes. Very well, he said, turning away. Alfred, prepare the infirmary. Protocol 7. Alfred gave Izuku a look of deep sympathy. Right this way, Master Izuku. We'll need your vital signs and a baseline physical assessment before we begin. Izuku followed, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. As Alfred attached sensors to his chest and arm, Izuku saw Bruce walk to a large, empty section of the cave floor. With a few keystrokes on a nearby console, the floor lit up, holographic walls rising to form a large, enclosed room. What is that? Izuku asked. We call it the Crucible, Alfred said grimly. It is a combat and tactical simulator. It can replicate any environment, any opponent. It is where Master Bruce tests things. Tests me? Alfred finished his work and gave Izuku's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Just remember, young man, he whispered. He is not testing to see if you can win. He is testing to see if you can endure. Bruce's voice echoed through the cavern. Izuku. Get in the Crucible. Taking a deep breath, Izuku walked into the holographic room. The light shimmered, and the cave walls vanished, replaced by the grimy, familiar brick of a Gotham alley. The simulation was perfect, down to the smell of damp garbage and the sound of distant sirens. Objective, survive, Bruce's voice commanded from an unseen speaker. From the shadows of the simulated alley, 3 combat drones emerged. They were sleek, black machines, gliding silently on muffled turbines. Red optical sensors fixed on him. What followed was a symphony of failure. Izuku dodged the first drone's stun blast, but ran directly into the path of the second. The electric shock seized his muscles, and he crashed to the floor, convulsing. He scrambled back to his feet, his limbs tingling. He tried to use the environment, to duck behind a holographic dumpster, but a third drone dropped from above, pinning him with a weighted net. He struggled, but it was useless. Simulation failed. The alley dissolved into a white grid. Again, Bruce's voice said, devoid of emotion. The alley reappeared. This time, Izuku anticipated the drone from above. He dodged all 3 initial attacks, his mind already analyzing their movements. They're fast, but their turning radius is poor. They attack in a predictable triangular formation. He managed to make one drone collide with another, but the third caught him with a concussive blast that sent him flying into a brick wall. The world spun, and his head throbbed. Simulation failed. Again. They ran the simulation a dozen more times. Each time, Izuku failed. But each time, he lasted a few seconds longer. He learned the patterns. He started anticipating their movements. He was bruised, exhausted, his body screaming in protest, but his mind was on fire. The floor panels are pressure sensitive, he mumbled to himself, spitting out a trickle of blood. They're tracking my footfalls. If I can use the environment to mask my steps. Bruce changed the scenario. Now Izuku was in a warehouse filled with crates. A stealth test. He had to reach the other side without being detected by laser grids and patrolling drones. He failed. He was caught by a motion sensor he hadn't seen. Again. He failed again, this time snagged by a proximity mine. On the third try, he almost made it. He had mapped the patrol routes, timed the laser grid deactivations. He was inches from the goal when the floor gave way, a trap he hadn't anticipated. His body was a canvas of fresh bruises, his lungs burned, but he hauled himself to his feet. The structural integrity was a variable, he gasped, wiping sweat and grime from his face. Have to check for weak points. Bruce was silent, watching from the control console. Alfred stood beside him, his expression one of pained concern. The physical diagnostics are clear, Alfred said quietly. He's reaching his limit. Any more and you risk serious injury. The body is not the point, Bruce replied, his eyes never leaving the screens that showed Izuku's biometric data. His heart rate was dangerously high, his adrenaline levels through the roof, but his brain activity was a frantic, focused storm. He was still thinking, still analyzing. He initiated the final phase. The warehouse dissolved. Izuku found himself standing in a hauntingly familiar scene. His own living room. A hologram of his mother, Inko Midoriya, stood by the stove, her back to him. Izuku? Is that you? She asked, her voice filled with a desperate worry that was almost too real. I was so scared. Please don't go out again. It's too dangerous. Izuku froze. Mom. Then, the scene shifted. A hologram of Bakugo appeared, sneering at him. Still playing hero, Deku? You're just gonna get yourself killed. You're worthless. The walls flickered, and he was back in the alley from 2 nights ago. The little girl with the teddy bear stood before him, crying. Why didn't you save me? She sobbed, before dissolving into pixels. It was a psychological assault, a barrage of his deepest fears and insecurities. His failure as a son, his uselessness as a person, his terror of not being good enough. He sank to his knees, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking. The physical pain was nothing compared to this. The test is over when you say it is, Bruce's voice said, softer now, almost tempting. Just say stop. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, tears mixing with the sweat on his face. He could quit. He could go home. He could crawl back into his safe, small life. But then he remembered the feeling of the coin in his hand. The weight of the choice. He remembered the look in Batman's eyes when he saw the notebook. He hadn't seen a worthless boy. He had seen a skill. Slowly, painfully, Izuku pushed himself back up to his feet. His legs trembled, his body screamed, but he stood. No, he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. I'm not done. Bruce watched the screen, a muscle in his jaw twitching. He initiated the last simulation. A no-win scenario. Izuku stood on a simulated rooftop. Across a chasm, a holographic little girl was tied to a chair. A bomb with a 10-second timer was beside her. Beside Izuku was a button. The bomb is rigged to the button, Bruce's voice explained. If you cross the chasm to save her, the bomb explodes. If you press the button, it will disarm the bomb, but the platform she is on will collapse into the chasm. There is no third option. You cannot save both. Choose. Izuku stared, his mind racing faster than it ever had before. Analyze. Analyze. There's always another way. He scanned the environment. He looked for a grapple point, a flaw in the bomb's design, a weakness in the platform's supports. There was nothing. It was a perfect trap. 5. 4. He couldn't sacrifice the girl. He couldn't let her die. His body moved on pure instinct, the same instinct that had made him throw his backpack in the alley. He sprinted forward and leaped across the chasm. He knew he wouldn't make it. He knew it was futile. But he had to try. 3. 2. He was in midair when the world flashed white. The simulated sound of the explosion was deafening. Simulation failed. The crucible dissolved, leaving Izuku lying on the cold, hard floor of the Batcave. He was defeated. He had failed every test. He had saved no one. He lay there, every muscle screaming, his spirit utterly crushed. He had given everything, and it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. He heard footsteps approaching. He didn't look up, bracing himself for the final, dismissive words. You failed. Go home. Bruce Wayne stood over him, his shadow falling across Izuku's exhausted body. He was silent for a long moment. The objective of the last test was not to save her, Bruce said, his voice a low, flat tone. There was no way to save her. The objective was to see if you would try. He paused. You tried every time. Get up. Izuku blinked, the words slowly penetrating his exhausted mind. He pushed himself up, his arms shaking violently from the strain. He stood before Bruce, swaying on his feet, bruised, bleeding, and utterly spent. Bruce looked him up and down, his gaze lingering on the boy's determined, tear-streaked face. He saw the bruises, the exhaustion, the pain. But beneath it all, he saw a core of unbreakable, unyielding steel, a spirit that refused to be extinguished. It was a foolish, reckless, and dangerous spirit. And it was one he recognized. The training begins at 0500, Bruce said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Don't be late. He turned and walked away towards the computer, leaving Izuku standing there in stunned, painful silence. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pain came rushing in, and Izuku's legs finally gave out. He collapsed to his knees, but before he hit the ground, a steady hand was on his arm. Alfred was there, a thick blanket in his other hand. Come along, Master Izuku, he said, his voice a balm on Izuku's raw nerves. That's quite enough for one night. He led the limping boy to a small, clean medbay set into an alcove of the cave. He gently sat Izuku down on a cot and began to methodically and efficiently clean and dress his cuts and bruises. His touch was gentle, practiced. Is he always like that? Izuku asked, wincing as Alfred applied an antiseptic to a cut on his cheek. Master Bruce believes that the best steel is forged in the hottest fire, Alfred said, his voice soft. He is not a man of many words, or of gentle reassurances. He shows his faith through expectation. By setting the bar impossibly high, he is telling you he believes you have the potential to reach it. He finished bandaging Izuku's arm, and then handed him a steaming mug. The boy took it with trembling hands. It was hot chocolate, rich and sweet. It was the most comforting thing he had ever tasted. Your notebook, Alfred said, nodding towards where the soggy book lay on a nearby table. You have a remarkable mind, young man. It is a chaotic mind, to be sure, but a brilliant one. Everyone always just called it creepy, Izuku mumbled into the mug. Geniuses are often misunderstood, Alfred replied with a small smile. Now drink up. There is a room prepared for you upstairs. You will need what little rest you can get. An hour later, Izuku found himself in a bedroom larger than his entire apartment. The bed had a carved wooden frame and sheets with a thread count he couldn't begin to guess. A massive window looked out over the dark, sprawling grounds of the estate. He had showered, the hot water stinging his bruises, and was now wearing a simple set of gray pajamas that Alfred had laid out for him. He was sore in places he didn't know he had muscles. He was exhausted down to his very soul. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw the same boy who had been bullied in a rainy alley, the same boy who dreamed of being a hero. But something was different. There was a new hardness in his eyes, a shadow of the crucible he had just endured. This wasn't a dream come true. It was a waking nightmare he had chosen. It was going to be a life of pain, of sacrifice, of living in the shadow of a man who was more myth than human. It was going to be the hardest thing he would ever do, and he couldn't wait to begin. The next 6 weeks were a blur of calculated agony. Izuku's life was reduced to a monastic, brutalist routine, governed by the cold logic of the Bat computer's chronometer and the unforgiving expectations of his new mentor. Sleep was a rationed commodity, pain a constant companion. The boy who had once filled notebooks with hero analysis was now having the fantasy brutally stripped away, the pages torn out and replaced with the harsh prose of reality. His days began at 0500 in the Batcave's state-of-the-art gym. Bruce Wayne was not a teacher in the traditional sense. He did not lecture or demonstrate with patience. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the peak human condition, and he expected Izuku to keep up. Again, Bruce would command, his voice a flat, unimpressed rumble. Izuku's arms would tremble as he tried to hold a plank position, his core muscles screaming in protest, sweat stinging his eyes. He had never been athletic, and his body was in a constant state of shock. The training was a cocktail of disciplines designed for urban warfare. Kisi fighting method for close-quarters combat in tight spaces, Krav Maga for its brutal efficiency, Jiu-Jitsu for grappling and submissions. Every morning was a new lesson in how to inflict and endure pain. "You are small," Bruce stated one morning, effortlessly blocking a clumsy punch from Izuku and using the boy's own momentum to send him sprawling onto the padded mats. "This will not change. You will never outmuscle your opponents. So you will outthink them. Use their size against them. Every fight is a physics problem. Find the solution." He didn't just train Izuku's body, he reforged it. His diet was meticulously controlled by Alfred, a precise blend of proteins, complex carbohydrates, and nutrients designed for maximum muscle repair and growth. His evenings were spent in agonizing stretching sessions or submerged in an ice bath to combat the inflammation that made every muscle fiber ache. The scrawny, soft boy was slowly being chiseled away, revealing a leaner, harder form underneath. He was still small, but his frame was now wired with dense, functional muscle. The physical regimen was grueling, but it was the mental conditioning that truly pushed Izuku to his limits. After the morning's physical torture, his afternoons were spent in front of the Bat computer's glowing screens. Bruce would pull up cold cases from the GCPD archives, some of them decades old. "The Riddler's first victim," Bruce said one afternoon, displaying a grainy black and white crime scene photo. Police report concluded it was a robbery gone wrong. They were wrong. Find the mistake. Here, in this realm of data and deduction, Izuku found his footing. While his body was a clumsy instrument he was still learning to play, his mind was a finely tuned weapon. He devoured the files, his eyes scanning autopsy reports, witness statements, and evidence logs with a speed that even Bruce found remarkable. The victim's wallet was missing, but not his watch, Izuku mumbled, his fingers flying across a holographic keyboard, cross-referencing newspaper archives from the era. It was a rare Finney Walker, worth 10 times what he likely carried in cash. A common thief would have taken the watch. The wallet was a misdirection. He pointed to a small, almost invisible detail in the photo, a faint smudge on the windowsill. And that smudge, the chemical residue report was inconclusive, but the notes mention a faint smell of kiwi. That's a key ingredient in the ink Enigma used for his first set of riddles, to make the paper phosphorescent under black light. The first clue was on the window, and the police missed it entirely. Bruce said nothing, but a single, almost imperceptible nod was all the praise Izuku would get. It was more than enough. "Information is your primary weapon," Bruce told him, his form silhouetted against the glowing screens. "Every other gadget is secondary. You must learn to read this city. Every crime scene is a story, every victim, a sentence. Every killer leaves a signature. Your job is to learn the language of Gotham's monsters so you can hunt them." The final piece of his training was the hardest, the art of becoming a ghost. Stealth. Bruce's own mastery of it was supernatural. He could move through the vast, echoing space of the Batcave without making a sound, appearing at Izuku's shoulder when the boy thought he was completely alone. To control a situation, you must first control the environment, Bruce explained, his voice seeming to come from the shadows themselves. And to control the environment, you must become an unseen, unknown variable within it. The training was a cruel game of cat and mouse. Izuku would be tasked with crossing the cave from one point to another without triggering any of the dozens of pressure plates, laser tripwires, or motion sensors. He failed constantly at first, his every clumsy step met with a blaring alarm or the sharp thwip of a rubber-tipped training dart hitting his back. But he learned. He started watching Bruce, not just his movements, but his stillness. He analyzed the schematics of the security system. He learned to use the cave's natural acoustics to mask his footfalls, to time his movements with the drip of water from a stalactite or the whir of the computer's cooling fans. He began to understand that stealth wasn't just about being quiet. It was about being an extension of the shadows. Woven through every lesson, every punch, every puzzle, was Bruce's core philosophy, the necessity of fear. Gotham is a city built on fear, Bruce said one night as they stood on a platform overlooking the dormant Batmobile. The criminals, the corrupt, the monsters, they don't respond to reason or compassion, they respond to a superstition. They need to believe that something worse than them is hunting them in the dark. We are not here to inspire hope in the public. We are here to inspire terror in the cowardly and the superstitious lot that preys on them. Fear is a tool. It is a scalpel to cut the cancer out of this city. It is a language everyone understands. Izuku absorbed the words, writing them down in a new, clean notebook Alfred had given him. He understood the logic. He had seen the terror on the faces of the thugs in the alley. It worked, but a part of him, a stubborn, empathetic core, recoiled from the coldness of it. A hero was supposed to make people feel safe, not terrified. Weren't they? He kept this thought to himself, a seed of doubt planted in the dark soil of his training. The seed sprouted during a simulation in the Crucible. After 6 weeks, Izuku had become proficient in the combat simulator. He could now consistently disable a squad of 4 combat drones, using a combination of acrobatic evasion and precise, non-lethal strikes to their joints and power sources. He was faster, stronger, and smarter than he had ever been. Bruce, seeing his progress, decided it was time for a more complex test. Hostage situation, Bruce's voice announced as the holographic walls flickered to life, forming the interior of a cramped, dimly lit pharmacy. A holographic man, gaunt and sweating, held a terrified pharmacist at gunpoint. The simulation was hyperrealistic, down to the scent of antiseptic and the desperate tremor in the hostage-taker's voice. "I just need the oxy," the hologram shouted, waving the gun erratically. "My daughter, she's sick. I can't afford the prescription. Please, just give it to me." Objective, neutralize the threat. Protect the civilian, Bruce's voice instructed, cold and clinical. You have 10 seconds before he becomes violent. Izuku moved, a blur of practice motion. He used the aisles for cover, his rubber-soled boots making no sound on the simulated linoleum. He was in position behind the man in under 4 seconds. His training kicked in, a series of pre-calculated actions. Disarm, incapacitate. A sharp strike to the wrist to break the man's grip on the gun, followed by a chokehold to render him unconscious. It was the efficient, logical solution, but Izuku hesitated. He heard the desperation in the man's voice. He saw the tears in his holographic eyes. This wasn't a monster. This was a man pushed to the edge, a father trying to save his child. It was a story Izuku had read in the city's crime statistics 100 times. A story of poverty and desperation. Instead of attacking, Izuku spoke. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, keeping to the shadows. "I can help you. We can get your daughter the medicine she needs. Just put the gun down." "This isn't the way." The hologram froze, his head snapping around. "Who's there?" "Show yourself. You're making a mistake," Izuku continued, taking a slow step into the light, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "Think about your daughter. What will happen to her if you get arrested, or worse?" From the control room, Bruce watched, his face like stone. "What is he doing?" he muttered. "He's trying to de-escalate, Master Bruce," Alfred said, his voice quiet. "He's being a fool," Bruce countered, his fingers hovering over the console. In the simulation, the hostage-taker was distracted by Izuku. The pharmacist, seeing his chance, made a sudden move to escape. The hologram, startled, reacted on pure instinct. He swung the gun, and a deafening bang echoed through the crucible. The pharmacist hologram collapsed, a splash of crimson data across its chest. Civilian casualty. Simulation failed. The simulation dissolved into a sterile white grid. Izuku stood there, frozen, his ears ringing. The image of the falling pharmacist was seared into his mind. He had failed. He had gotten someone killed. Bruce's footsteps were heavy as he entered the crucible. He didn't yell. His voice was low, controlled, and filled with a chilling disappointment that was far worse than anger. "Explain what you were thinking," he said. I thought I could talk to him," Izuku stammered, his gaze fixed on the spot where the pharmacist had fallen. He was scared. He wasn't a killer. He was just desperate. He had a gun, Bruce stated, as if it were the only fact that mattered. He was a threat. Your objective was to neutralize that threat. You had him. He was exposed, his attention divided. The solution was simple, efficient, and guaranteed to protect the hostage. Instead, you tried to appeal to his better nature. Bruce stepped closer, his shadow falling over Izuku. "Let me tell you what you did. You introduced a new variable, yourself. You engaged him in a dialogue, giving him time to think, to panic. You gave him options. And in Gotham, when you give a desperate man with a gun options, people get hurt. Your sentimentality, your belief that everyone can be reasoned with, that is a fatal flaw. It is a weakness that will get you, and the people you are trying to protect, killed." "But he needed help," Izuku protested, his voice rising. "We could have helped him. Isn't that what a hero is supposed to do? Help people? We are not heroes," Bruce snapped, his voice finally cracking with raw, unfiltered fury. "We are a deterrent. We are the line that holds the abyss at bay. I am not training you to be a social worker. I am training you to be a soldier in a war. And in war, hesitation kills. Compassion is a luxury we cannot afford. When you are in the field, there is the mission, and there is nothing else. You follow the plan. You execute. You do not feel. Is that understood?" Tears of frustration and shame welled in Izuku's eyes. He nodded, unable to speak. He understood the words, but his heart rejected them. How could he turn off his empathy? It was the very thing that drove him, the engine of his desire to save people. Bruce saw the conflict in the boy's eyes, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I know this is difficult to accept," he said, his voice returning to its controlled monotone, "but I have seen where that path leads. Good men, better men than you or I, have died because they hesitated. Because they chose to see the man instead of the threat. You cannot make that mistake. Gotham will not allow it." He turned and walked out of the crucible, leaving Izuku alone with the ghosts of his failure. The lesson was clear. To be what Bruce wanted him to be, he had to cut out a piece of himself. He had to learn how to be an instrument of darkness. And he wasn't sure if he could. A week later, Bruce decided Izuku was ready. Not for active duty, but for observation. "You need to see it," Bruce said as he prepared for his nightly patrol. "You need to understand what we are truly up against. All the simulations in the world cannot replicate the filth of this city's streets." He presented Izuku with a suit. It wasn't a costume. It was a uniform of shadows. The material was a matte black, triple-weave Kevlar, with reinforced plating over the chest and joints. There were no bright colors, no symbols. Just a pair of dark, tactical pants, a form-fitting top, gloves, boots, and a simple domino mask that covered his eyes and the bridge of his nose. It was anonymous, practical, and designed for one purpose: to blend into the night. Izuku put it on. The material was heavy, constricting. He looked at his reflection in the polished black hood of the Batmobile. He saw a stranger. A shadow. He wasn't Izuku Midoriya anymore. He wasn't even a hero in training. He was just a dark shape, stripped of identity. "You will be on communications and observation only," Bruce commanded as he settled into the driver's seat of the Batmobile. The cockpit was a dizzying array of screens and switches. "You do not engage. You do not speak. You do not interfere. You watch, you listen, and you learn. Understood?" "Understood," Izuku replied, his voice muffled by the mask's integrated comms unit. The roar of the Batmobile's turbine engine was a physical force, vibrating through the cave. The massive doors opened, and they shot out into the night, a black rocket ascending from the earth. The experience was terrifying and exhilarating. They tore through Gotham's streets, a phantom of vengeance, the city's underbelly a blur of neon and decay outside the reinforced canopy. Their destination was the industrial docks, where Bruce had intelligence on an arms deal going down. A shipment of military-grade automatic rifles was being sold to the Maroney crime family. They parked on the roof of a derelict warehouse a quarter-mile away. From this vantage point, equipped with a high-powered listening device and thermal imaging binoculars, Izuku had a perfect view of the meeting point, a rusty, decommissioned freighter moored at the pier. 10 hostiles, Izuku reported, his voice a professional calm he didn't feel. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. 6 on the pier, 4 on the deck of the ship. All armed. The buyers have arrived. I see the exchange of currency for a weapons crate. Maintain observation, Batman's voice crackled in his ear. The dark night had already disappeared from the roof, melting into the labyrinth of shipping containers and cranes below. Izuku watched through the binoculars, his knuckles white. He followed Batman's thermal signature, as he moved with an impossible silence and speed. He was a predator stalking his prey. The attack, when it came, was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. It began with a sound, the shattering of a floodlight on a high crane, plunging a section of the pier into darkness. Panic erupted. Shouted questions. Then, a man screamed, a choked, terrified sound that was cut off abruptly. Another man was suddenly yanked into the air, vanishing into the rafters of a loading crane. Izuku could barely follow the action. He saw glimpses of a black cape, the flash of a batarang, the sickening crunch of bone on steel. Batman moved through them not like a man, but like a force of nature. He was everywhere at once, a phantom that struck from the shadows and disappeared before its victims even knew what had hit them. He was using the environment, the darkness, the fear. It was everything Bruce had taught him, executed with terrifying perfection. In less than a minute it was over. The 10 men were left groaning on the ground, variously disarmed, unconscious, or tied up with high-tensile cables. Batman stood in the center of the pier, a dark statue amidst the wreckage of the deal, and for the first time, Izuku saw what Bruce had been talking about. It wasn't just about neutralizing threats. He zoomed in on the face of one of the conscious criminals, a man who was now zip-tied to a railing. The man's eyes were wide, staring into the darkness where Batman had been. He was trembling uncontrollably, his face a mask of pure abject terror. He wasn't looking at a man who had beaten him. He was looking at a monster who had hunted him. He would carry that fear with him for the rest of his life. The logic was undeniable. The fear worked. It was a brutally effective weapon. It had neutralized 10 armed criminals without a single fatality. It had stopped a shipment of deadly weapons from hitting the streets. By all metrics, it was a victory. So why did Izuku feel so sick? He lowered the binoculars, his hands shaking. He had watched his hero, his mentor, inspire a level of terror in another human being that made his stomach churn. He saw the logic, but his soul recoiled from the method. He had analyzed Batman for years, idolized his effectiveness. But to see the raw, visceral fear he caused up close, it was different. It was deeply, profoundly unsettling. Batman's voice came over the comms, pulling him from his thoughts. The situation is contained. GCPD is en route. Rendezvous at the extraction point. Izuku met him back at the rooftop. Batman stood at the edge, his cape billowing in the cold, salty wind, a guardian gargoyle watching over his city. You see now, Batman said, not a question but a statement. This is what it takes. This is the only language they will ever understand. Izuku looked out at the city, at the distant lights and the endless darkness between them. He thought of the desperate man in the pharmacy simulation and the terrified man on the pier. Were they really so different? He looked down at his own gloved hands, at the dark, anonymous uniform he wore. He had followed the lesson. He had watched. He had learned. And the lesson was that in Bruce Wayne's Gotham, there was no room for heroes who saved people. There was only room for a dark knight who punished them. And as he stood there, a shadow next to the shadow, a terrifying question echoed in the deepest parts of his heart. And learning this lesson in darkness, what part of himself would he have to kill? The weeks following Izuku's first patrol bled into a new phase of his training. The lines between night and day, between the boy and the burgeoning vigilante, blurred into a perpetual state of exhaustion and hypervigilance. He was a creature of the cave now, his skin pale from the lack of sunlight, his eyes accustomed to the glow of holographic screens. Bruce, satisfied that Izuku could handle the raw reality of Gotham's violence without breaking, began to integrate him more deeply into his nightly operations. Izuku was not yet a partner, not a Robin. He was an asset. A tool. His official designation was Oracle 2, a nod to the original information broker who had once been an invaluable part of Batman's network. From his station in the Batcave, he was Bruce's eyes and ears. He monitored police scanners, hacked into security feeds, and cross-referenced databases in real time, feeding his mentor a constant stream of tactical information. For hostiles, Southwest Corridor, armed with Glocks, he would report, his voice a calm, steady presence in Bruce's ear. Thermal shows a fifth in the ventilation shaft above you. He's stationary, likely in ambush. He excelled at the work. His analytical mind, once confined to notebooks, was now plugged into the city's digital nervous system. He could predict patrol routes, identify structural weaknesses in buildings, and flag suspicious activity with an intuitive speed that bordered on precognitive. Bruce never offered praise, but the increasing complexity of the tasks he assigned Izuku was a testament to his growing trust in the boy's abilities. Yet, a chasm remained between them. It was a silent, ideological gulf born from the lesson in darkness Izuku had learned at the docks. He did his job with ruthless efficiency, but he felt a piece of himself calcifying, turning hard and cold like the stone of the cave. He watched Batman's nightly war, a ballet of brutal, fear-driven justice, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was helping the mission, but he did not believe in the philosophy that fueled it. He still believed in saving people, not just punishing them. It was during one of these long, quiet nights in the cave that the first whispers began. It started as a trickle of anomalies in the city's usual current of crime. A series of bizarre, violent incidents that didn't fit any established patterns. A veteran police officer, a decorated hero of the force, suddenly screaming about spiders crawling from his skin and opening fire on his own squad car. A respected judge found cowering in her chambers, babbling about a jury of melting-faced demons sentencing her to death. A bus driver who deliberately crashed his vehicle into a storefront, later telling paramedics that the street had turned into a river of blood filled with drowning children. The victims were unconnected, their demographics scattered. The only common thread was the aftermath. Each was left in a state of profound, catatonic terror, their minds seemingly shattered by a waking nightmare. The official GCPD line was a new, potent hallucinogenic street drug, something called nightmare haze. Bruce was dismissive at first. Another chemical designer peddling poison. Gordon's narcotics division will handle it. But Izuku, tasked with compiling the data, saw a pattern that the raw statistics obscured. He stayed up long after Bruce had retired to the manor, his eyes burning from staring at the screens, piecing together a puzzle no one else had realized existed. He pulled up the victims' case files, not just the police reports, but their entire lives. He cross-referenced their public records, social media histories, and news articles. He was looking for a connection, any thread that might tie them together. It took him 2 sleepless nights, fueled by Alfred's endless supply of strong tea, but he found it. He waited for Bruce in the cave the next evening, his findings arranged on the main holographic display. As the dark night descended the stairs, Izuku spoke, his voice ringing with a conviction that made Bruce pause. "It's not a drug, and the victims aren't random," Izuku stated, foregoing any preamble. Bruce raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Explain." "The media is focusing on the what, the hallucinogenic effects. But they're missing the who?" "I analyzed the lives of all 12 victims." Izuku brought up a series of images on the screen, Officer Miller accepting a medal, Judge Davies cutting the ribbon at a new community center, the bus driver, Mr. Abernathy, receiving an award for 20 years of perfect attendance. "Look at them," Izuku urged, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. Officer Miller was famous in his precinct for his annual toy drive. Judge Davies volunteers at a legal aid clinic for the poor. Mr. Abernathy spent his weekends coaching underprivileged kids in baseball. They aren't just random citizens. He tapped a key, and a new title appeared above the collage of smiling faces, pillars of hope. Every single victim, Izuku continued, is a symbol. They're the quiet, everyday heroes of their communities. The people who make you believe that Gotham isn't entirely lost. The ones who represent hope. Bruce stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. Izuku had his full attention. The drug, the nightmare haze, isn't being sold for profit. It's being administered targetedly, through aerosolized contact in a seemingly public space, an elevator, a coffee shop, a bus. The attacker isn't a drug dealer. They're a terrorist. They're not just trying to create fear, they're trying to prove that hope is an illusion. They're extinguishing the city's brightest lights, one by one, and showing everyone the darkness that's left behind. He took a breath, his theory culminating in a single, chilling name. This isn't the work of some new player. It's a signature. The methodology has evolved, but the philosophy is the same. It's him. It's Jonathan Crane. The name hung in the cold air of the cave. Dr. Jonathan Crane, the disgraced Arkham psychiatrist, the self-proclaimed master of fear. The Scarecrow. He had been presumed dead for over a year, supposedly killed in a chemical explosion during a confrontation with Batman. Bruce walked slowly to the console, his eyes scanning the data Izuku had compiled. He ran his own diagnostic programs, his fingers ablur across the keyboard. He pulled up Arkham's old psychiatric profile on Crane, comparing the psychological drivers with the targeting pattern Izuku had identified. After a long, tense silence, he spoke. The toxin is new. Far more sophisticated than his old formula. It doesn't just trigger the amygdala. It seems to rewrite recent sensory input, mapping it onto the victim's deepest psychological traumas. It's not just a fear toxin. It's a personalized nightmare engine. He turned to face Izuku. Your analysis is sound. Crane is back. The admission was a quiet earthquake. For the first time, Izuku hadn't just provided data. He had steered the entire investigation. He had seen the shape of the monster in the dark when Bruce had only seen shadows. A new dynamic was being forged between them, a shift from mentor and student to something closer to colleagues. Crane's previous hideouts are all compromised, Bruce said, his mind already churning through tactical possibilities. He'll need a new lab, one with access to the specific chemical precursors needed for this new toxin. He turned the investigation back over to Izuku. Cross-reference all recent chemical supply shipments in the tri-state area with properties zoned for industrial or laboratory use that have been recently acquired through shell corporations. Focus on abandoned or condemned facilities. Crane has an affinity for places that are decaying. Izuku's fingers flew across the keyboard. Already on it, he replied, his voice humming with purpose. This was his element. He was hunting a ghost in the city of data, and he was closing in. For hours, he sifted through mountains of digital paperwork, his mind a whirlwind of LLCs, shipping manifests, and zoning permits. He built a complex algorithm to flag anomalies, and finally, after chasing down a dozen dead ends, he found it. An abandoned chemical plant on the industrial outskirts of the city, near the old slaughterhouses, Ace Chemicals. The plant had been officially decommissioned for years, but 3 months ago, it had received a massive, off-the-books shipment of psychotropic compounds and neurotransmitter inhibitors, purchased through a shell corporation with ties to a defunct Arkham research grant. A grant that had been overseen by Dr. Jonathan Crane. I've got him, Izuku said, a triumphant thrill in his voice. Ace Chemicals. It's him. Bruce studied the schematics of the plant that Izuku pulled up. It was a sprawling, multi-level complex, a maze of pipes, catwalks, and vats. It's a fortress, he mused, and if he knows we're coming, it will be a death trap. So we don't let him know we're coming, Izuku said, his confidence surging. He pointed to a secondary access point on the schematic, a storm drain that fed into the plant's lowest sublevel. Thermal scans show the main entrances are rigged with motion sensors, but this drain is cold. He's focused on the obvious points of entry. We can use it for a stealth reconnaissance mission. Get in, plant a tracer on his main mixing vat, and get out. We can monitor his production schedule and plan a full assault when he's most vulnerable. Bruce looked from the screen to the boy beside him. He saw the fire in Izuku's eyes, the sharp, analytical brilliance that had first caught his attention in that rainy alley. He had pushed the boy, berated him for his sentimentality, and tried to mold him into a weapon of fear. But here, in the cold calculus of the hunt, Izuku's unique mind was proving to be the sharpest weapon in his arsenal. Alfred, Bruce said into his calms. Prepare 2 suits. He looked back at Izuku. You're not staying in the cave tonight. You're coming with me. The words hit Izuku like a physical blow. A jolt of pure, unadulterated shock, followed by a wave of icy dread and a powerful surge of exhilaration. He was going into the field, not as an observer, but as a participant. It was the moment he had been training for, the moment he had both craved and feared. Your objective is the same as it is in here, Bruce said, his tone deadly serious as they suited up in the armory. Izuku wore the same anonymous black tactical gear as before, but this time it felt different. It felt real. You are my eyes. You will scan for traps, monitor for enemy movement, and guide my path. You will be my ghost. No contact. No engagement. We get in, we plant the bug, we get out. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Izuku said, his voice steady despite the frantic beating of his heart. He ran a diagnostic on the advanced sensor suite built into his mask's visor, a suite he had helped design himself. It could read thermal signatures, detect trace chemical compounds in the air, and pick up minute electronic signals. As they rode in the Batmobile, the silence between them was thick with unspoken tension. Izuku ran through the mission parameters in his head a dozen times, memorizing the plant's layout, his heart a cold, heavy lump in his chest. They left the car a mile from the plant, proceeding the rest of the way on foot, 2 shadows moving through the industrial wasteland. The air was thick with the chemical tang of the river and the smell of decay. Ace chemicals loomed before them, a skeletal silhouette against the sickly yellow glow of the city's sky. Its smokestacks were like broken teeth, its windows dark and empty eyes. A place of death and rebirth for some of Gotham's most infamous monsters. I'm in position, Izuku whispered into his comms, his voice barely a breath. He had slipped through the storm drain's grate and was now in the damp, dark tunnel. His visor's night vision cast the world in an eerie green light. No sensors detected. The path is clear. Proceed, Batman's voice echoed back, a disembodied rumble. Izuku moved with a practiced stealth that was a world away from the clumsy boy who had first entered the crucible. He was light on his feet, his movements fluid and silent. He navigated the labyrinthine maintenance tunnels of the sublevel, his visor scanning every inch of the path ahead. Wait, he whispered, freezing in place. I'm picking up a pressure plate. 10 feet ahead, concealed under a loose floor grate. He projected a schematic of the trap onto Batman's heads-up display. It's rigged to a series of aerosol nozzles in the ceiling. If you trip it, this entire tunnel will be flooded. Acknowledged, Batman replied. Find a bypass. Izuku traced the wiring with his sensors, finding a junction box hidden behind a rusted panel. A few deft movements with a multi-tool, and the trap was disabled. Bypass complete. Path is clear. They continued this way, a silent, deadly partnership. Izuku was the mind, the scout, his senses augmented by technology. Batman was the body, the phantom, moving with lethal grace based on the intelligence his young protege provided. They were a perfectly synchronized machine, flowing through the chemical plant's defenses like water. They reached the main laboratory, a vast, cathedral-like chamber filled with enormous chemical vats, bubbling beakers, and a complex network of pipes. In the center of the room, a man in a tattered suit and a grotesque burlap sack mask was hunched over a control panel, making adjustments to a large, churning vat that glowed with a faint, sickly green light. The Scarecrow. They watched from a high catwalk, hidden in the shadows. That's the main mixing vat, Izuku whispered, his analysis confirming its function based on the chemical signatures his visor was detecting. If I can get to the terminal beside it, I can plant the tracer. Negative, Batman countered. It's too exposed. I'll do it. You maintain lookout. But before Batman could move, a new variable entered the equation. A half-dozen armed thugs, mercenaries by the look of their gear, entered the lab, dragging a bound and gagged man between them. They threw him at Crane's feet. The last of the ingredients, Doctor, one of the thugs said. Just as you asked? A man with a pathological fear of heights. Crane turned, his sackcloth mask unnervingly expressive in its blankness. He circled the captive like a vulture. Excellent, he hissed, his voice a dry, rasping sound. The final catalyst. The purest fear is not manufactured, it is harvested. He produced a wicked-looking syringe filled with a clear liquid. This will not make you see your fear, my friend, Crane whispered to the terrified man. This will make you become it. Your very essence, the terror in your soul, will be distilled and used to perfect my masterpiece. This wasn't just a lab. It was a torture chamber. A cold rage, something Izuku had never felt before, washed over him. This was what Bruce had tried to warn him about. The sheer, unadulterated evil that defied reason or compassion. Bruce, he whispered, his voice tight. We can't let him do that. We have to intervene. The mission was reconnaissance. Batman's voice was a low warning. We are not equipped for a direct assault against this many hostiles. There's no time. He's going to kill him. Suddenly, a high-pitched alarm blared through the lab. Red lights began to flash. On the catwalk, a laser grid sprang to life, trapping them. Perimeter breach detected. One of the thugs yelled. Crane looked up, his masked face turning directly towards their position. It seems we have bats in our belfry, he hissed. How rude of you to come uninvited. It was a trap. Crane had known they were there the entire time. The cold storm drain, the easily bypassed traps, it had all been a ruse to lure them into the heart of his lair. He hadn't been perfecting his toxin. He had been setting his stage. The ventilation system is activating, Izuku said, his visor flashing with warnings. He's going to flood the entire chamber with his new toxin. Fall back, Batman commanded, already moving towards their entry point. Now, but as they turned, their escape was cut off. A heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing the catwalk. They were caged. Below, Crane laughed, a dry, rattling sound that scraped at the nerves. There is no escape, he called up to them. The show is about to begin. I've been so eager to see, what does the great Batman fear? A thick, yellowish gas began to pour from the vents in the ceiling. Izuku's mask had its own internal air supply, but it wouldn't last forever. Panic began to claw at the edges of his disciplined mind. Deku, report. Batman's voice cut through his rising fear. He had used the name Izuku had chosen for himself, not his designation. It was a commander rallying his soldier. Izuku forced himself to focus, to push past the fear. He ran a quick scan. The gas is too dense. It will overwhelm our filters in 90 seconds. But... His eyes darted around the room, his mind racing. The sprinkler system. It's fed by a secondary water main. If we can trigger it, the water will help neutralize the airborne toxin and might short out some of his systems. He located the manual override, a valve control on the far side of the lab, near Crane's position. It was an impossible shot. I can't get a clear angle from here, Batman said, his own sensors confirming Izuku's analysis. I can, Izuku said, a desperate plan forming in his mind. He looked at Batman, his eyes wide behind his mask. Trust me. Before Bruce could protest, Izuku did the last thing he expected. He ran to the edge of the catwalk, took a deep breath, and leaped into the open air. The air in Izuku's lungs felt like it was turning to ice. For a terrifying, eternal second, he was suspended between the steel catwalk and the hard concrete floor 50 feet below, a boy wrapped in shadows, willingly plunging into the heart of the trap. He heard Batman shout his name, not his designation, not his chosen codename, but his name, a raw, guttural sound of shock and fury that was swallowed by the cavernous lab. His leap was not a desperate, suicidal plunge. It was a calculated risk, a physics problem he had solved in the split second he had to make the choice. His target wasn't the floor, but a thick, insulated coolant pipe that ran horizontally along the wall about 20 feet down. He hit the pipe with a jarring impact that radiated up his arms and rattled his teeth. His fingers, strengthened by weeks of brutal conditioning, clamped around the cold metal, his grip slipping on the condensation. He swung wildly for a moment, his legs kicking out into the empty air, the armed thugs below now shouting and pointing up at him. The yellow-green fear toxin, thick as morning fog, was already beginning to pool on the floor, its tendrils rising towards him. He's on the pipes. One of the mercenaries yelled, raising his rifle. A black shape descended from the catwalk above. It wasn't a silent, graceful glide, it was a controlled, aggressive drop. Batman landed amongst the thugs like a thunderclap, his cape flaring out like the wings of some great, avenging demon. The first shots from their rifles were wild, panicked bursts that ricocheted off the chemical vats around them. Batman was already in motion, a whirlwind of black fists and armored boots. He was a force of pure, kinetic violence, his movements economical and devastating. The fight was a diversion, a precious few seconds of chaos that he was buying for Izuku. Izuku didn't waste it. Using his momentum, he swung himself forward, launching off the pipe and grabbing onto a service ladder. He scrambled down, his boots clanging against the metal rungs. The air was growing thick and cloying, and he could feel the toxin beginning to seep through the seals of his mask, a faint, sweet, and sickly smell like rotting flowers. His rebreather was working overtime, but it was a losing battle. The concentration of the gas was too high. He dropped the last 10 feet, landing in a crouch behind a row of chemical barrels. Across the floor, Batman was methodically and brutally dismantling the mercenary squad. But Crane wasn't focused on the fight. His grotesque, sackcloth face was turned towards Izuku, his unseen eyes tracking the boy's every move. A new little bird, trying to fly, Scarecrow rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally in the vast chamber. He raised a strange, custom-built weapon that looked like a cross between a fire extinguisher and a high-pressure agricultural sprayer. Let's see if we can't clip your wings. Izuku's objective was the sprinkler override valve, a large, red wheel on the far wall. It was 50 feet of open ground away. He broke from cover, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. He was a sprinter, his mind a metronome counting down the seconds until his filters failed. 30 seconds of air left. Maybe less. Crane aimed his sprayer and squeezed the trigger. It wasn't a stream of gas that erupted from the nozzle, but a concentrated, almost liquid jet of the raw, unaerosolized toxin. Izuku dove, rolling behind a stack of pallets as the viscous yellow fluid splattered against the concrete where he had just been. The concrete hissed and seemed to darken, as if stained by pure fear. A direct hit from that would be catastrophic. From the corner of his eye, he saw Batman dispatch the last of the thugs with a final, bone-jarring blow. But now Crane's full attention was on Izuku. "Come on, little hero," Crane taunted, stalking forward. "Don't you want to see the truth? The truth that lurks beneath that silly mask?" Izuku knew he couldn't make it to the valve. Crane was between him and his goal. He needed a new plan. His eyes darted around, his mind, even in its panic state, processing the environment, looking for a variable, an opportunity. He saw it, a network of high-pressure hoses connected to one of the main chemical vats, the kind used for emergency cleaning. He scrambled towards the hose controls, his movements desperate. Crane fired his sprayer again. This time, he anticipated Izuku's dodge. The stream of liquid fear caught Izuku across the back of his legs. It wasn't a direct dose, but the contact was enough. The material of his suit began to smoke slightly, and an intense, burning cold shot up his legs. He ignored the pain, his gloved hands fumbling with the release valve for the hoses. He yanked it open. A powerful jet of industrial solvent erupted from the hose, a chaotic, thrashing serpent of liquid. Izuku wrestled with it, aiming the torrent not at Crane, but at the sprinkler override on the wall. The high-pressure stream hit the red wheel, the force of it slowly, agonizingly, beginning to turn it. "Clever boy," Crane hissed, but too late. He lunged forward, no longer content with his sprayer. In his hand was a syringe, the same kind he had intended to use on his captive. It was filled with a milky, opalescent fluid, the pure, distilled nightmare. Izuku tried to dodge, but his legs felt sluggish, heavy, the toxin already seeping into his system. Crane was surprisingly fast. He grabbed the front of Izuku's suit, his other hand bringing the needle up. Izuku slammed the heel of his boot into Crane's knee, earning a grunt of pain but not breaking the man's grip. The needle plunged down. Izuku twisted violently, and the needle missed his neck, instead sinking deep into the thick muscle of his shoulder, through the reinforced fabric of his suit. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pain and terror. An unimaginable cold spread from the injection site, a tidal wave of chemical dread that crashed through his veins and slammed into his brain. The world dissolved. The sounds of the lab, the hiss of the gas, Batman's approaching footsteps, Crane's dry chuckle, faded into a distant, underwater roar. The green glow of his night vision visor warped, colors bleeding at the edges, the world fracturing like a broken mirror. He was no longer in Ace Chemicals. He was standing in a vast, empty gray space. The floor was a cracked, barren wasteland that stretched to an infinite horizon. Above him, the sky was a bruised, starless purple. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. A sound echoed in the emptiness. Laughter. It was cruel and familiar. Still scribbling in that creepy stalker journal, Deku? He turned. A monstrous caricature of Katsuki Bakugo stood before him. He was 10 feet tall, his body forged from cracked stone and molten rage, his crimson eyes burning like embers. Each of his hands was a snarling, explosive maw. You really thought you could be a hero? The monster boomed, its voice a chorus of every insult Izuku had ever endured. You're nothing. A pebble trying to stop a tidal wave. You have no power. You are worthless. The stone Bakugo slammed a fist into the ground, and the gray wasteland cracked and split open. Izuku stumbled back, his heart a frantic hummingbird in his chest. This wasn't real. He knew it wasn't real. It was the toxin. Crane's new formula. It takes your deepest psychological traumas and makes them real. Analyze, a tiny, rational part of his brain screamed. Fight it. But knowing it was a hallucination didn't stop the fear. The fear was real. The feeling of utter, hopeless inadequacy was the most real thing he had ever known. The scene shifted. He was in his childhood bedroom. It was dark, the only light coming from a flickering computer monitor. He saw a small, green-haired boy, his own younger self, watching a video of the hero All Might. The boy was trembling, tears streaming down his face. His mother, Inko, knelt beside him, her own eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Izuku, his mother's voice whispered, but it was distorted, laced with a cold, hollow pity. I'm so sorry. The words she had spoken that day, the words that had broken his heart, echoed around him, amplified 1,000 times. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He was a disappointment. A broken dream. He had failed her just by being born. The world dissolved again. Now, he stood before the gates of Wayne Manor. They were twisted and warped, the wrought iron forming the faces of leering demons. The doors creaked open, and a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Batman, but twisted, nightmarish. His suit was fused with his skin, his flesh gray and dead-looking. His cowl had grown, the ears like the horns of some great, black devil. The symbol on his chest was not a bat, but a skull. I gave you a chance, the Batman demon growled, its voice the grinding of tombstones. I thought your mind could be a weapon. But I was wrong. It pointed a long, skeletal finger at him. You are a liability. A sentimental child. You hesitated. You brought emotion into my war. You are just like the other one. The demon stepped aside, and behind him, suspended in the air by invisible chains, was a tattered, blood-soaked Robin costume. The one from the memorial case in the cave. He died because he was weak, the demon whispered, its voice seeping into Izuku's soul like poison. He thought he could save everyone. And his weakness got him killed. Just like your weakness will get me killed. You will fail. You will watch me die. And it will be your fault. This was it. His deepest, most secret fear. Not just that he would fail, but that his failure would cost the person who had finally given him a chance. The weight of it was crushing, a physical pressure that forced the air from his lungs. He sank to his knees, gasping, overwhelmed. The rational part of his mind was gone, drowned in the tide of pure, manufactured terror. He was just a small, useless boy again, crying in the face of a monster he could never hope to defeat. Deku. The monster whispered, the name now a curse, a final, damning judgment. He curled into a ball on the ground, his hands clamped over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut, trying to block out the images, the voices, the all-consuming fear. In the real world, less than 30 seconds had passed. The moment the needle sank into Izuku's shoulder, a change had come over the boy. He had screamed, and then his body had gone rigid, his eyes, wide and unseeing behind his mask, staring at something that wasn't there. He stumbled back, swatting at invisible phantoms, a low, terrified whimper escaping his lips. Crane laughed, a triumphant, rasping sound. Yes, show me your mind, little bird. Show me all your beautiful fears. He didn't get to savor his victory. A black gauntlet clamped around his throat from behind, lifting him clean off his feet. Batman was there, his white lenses glowing with an incandescent fury. The rage coming off him was a palpable force, colder and more terrifying than any chemical Crane could ever concoct. What did you do to him? Batman's voice was not a growl. It was a low, vibrational threat, the sound of a fault line shifting deep beneath the earth. Crane choked, clawing at the gauntlet. I gave him the truth. With a flick of his wrist, Batman hurled Scarecrow across the room. He crashed into a control panel with a shower of sparks and crumpled to the floor in a heap. Batman didn't spare him a second glance. His only priority was the small, trembling figure on the floor. He knelt beside Izuku, who was now curled in a tight, fetal position, shivering uncontrollably. Izuku, he said, his voice firm, trying to cut through the chemical haze. Izuku, listen to me. It's not real. It's the toxin. Fight it. But Izuku didn't respond. He was lost, drowning in the depths of his own mind. Batman could see the terror in the boy's posture, a complete psychological collapse. The sound of the high-pressure hose finally forcing the sprinkler valve open, followed by the hiss of water beginning to spray from the ceiling, was a distant, irrelevant noise. A wave of something cold and sickeningly familiar washed over Bruce. Guilt. It was a ghost he knew all too well. He had done this. He had brought a child, a brilliant, hopeful, and dangerously naive child, into his war. He had seen the boy's potential but had underestimated his vulnerability. He had seen the steel in his spine but had forgotten the fragility of his heart. He looked at Izuku, shivering and broken on the floor of this chemical hell, and he didn't see a soldier or an asset. He saw Jason. The memory hit him like a physical blow, a phantom pain from an old wound that had never truly healed. Jason Todd, his second Robin. Another brilliant, angry, and vulnerable boy. A boy he had failed. A boy who had died, brutalized and alone, because Bruce had put him in the path of a monster. He had sworn, after that day, that he would never again be responsible for the death of a child. And yet, here he was. The sprinkler system kicked in fully, and a downpour of cold, chemically treated water rained down, dousing the lab. The yellowish gas began to thin, the water neutralizing the airborne toxin. Alarms blared, mixing with the hiss of the water. Bruce gently scooped Izuku into his arms. The boy was light, almost frail feeling beneath the tactical gear. He was still muttering, broken words falling from his lips. My fault, useless. Deku, cradling the boy against his chest, a protective, almost paternal gesture he hadn't allowed himself in years, Batman rose to his feet. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He looked at the unconscious form of Jonathan Crane, who was beginning to stir amidst the sparking consoles. His first instinct, a dark, primal urge, was to go over there and finish it. To break him. To make him pay for what he had done to this boy. But he couldn't. Izuku needed him. With a final, chilling glare that promised a future reckoning, Batman turned his back on his defeated foe. He fired his grappling hook into the high ceiling, the line pulling them upwards, away from the chaos. He crashed through a high window, landing on the rain-slicked roof of the chemical plant as the sounds of approaching GCPD sirens began to cut through the night. He didn't stop. He ran across the rooftops, Izuku a dead weight in his arms, the boy shivering a constant, damning reminder of his failure. He ran until he reached the hidden location of the Batmobile. Inside the cockpit, he laid Izuku gently on the passenger side medbay platform. He injected a broad-spectrum antitoxin into the boy's arm, a standard countermeasure for Crane's old formulas. But this was something new. The antitoxin would help, but it wouldn't be a cure. The boy would have to fight his way out of the nightmare on his own. As the Batmobile roared back towards the cave, Bruce drove in a grim, tormented silence. He had gone to Ace Chemicals tonight with a soldier, a tactical asset. But he was returning with a child he had broken. The cave was a sanctuary of silence and shadows, a stark contrast to the chaos of the last hour. Alfred was waiting for them on the main platform, his face etched with concern, a gurney and medical supplies at the ready. He had been monitoring the entire situation through their comms. "Master Bruce," Alfred began, his eyes falling on the catatonic boy in Batman's arms. Bruce said nothing. He gently placed Izuku on the gurney, his movements filled with a care that bordered on reverence. "Prepare the infirmary," he commanded, his voice hoarse. "Full neurological scan. Monitor his vitals. Get me a sample of the toxin from his suit for analysis." As Alfred wheeled the unconscious boy towards the med bay, Bruce stood alone by the Bat computer. He slowly, deliberately, began to remove his armor. The cowl came off first, then the gauntlets, each piece landing on the steel platform with a heavy, final-sounding thud. He was left standing in his sweat-soaked undersuit, no longer the Batman, just Bruce Wayne. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt every one of his years. He felt the weight of every scar, every failure, every ghost that haunted the dark corners of this cave. He had set out to forge a weapon. He had taken a boy's hope and tried to temper it into a tool for his war. He had subjected him to a crucible of fire and pain, believing it would make him stronger. But he had forgotten that even the strongest steel, when pushed too far, doesn't just bend. It shatters. And the sound of that shattering was now the only thing he could hear.